So before we get started, those of us who are panelists, maybe just mute when you're not speaking because we are recording and we want to make sure we can try to get the best sound quality as possible. All right, well, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started today. Hello to all who are joining us today and those who are going to watch us in the future when it's up on YouTube. We're so glad to host our 10th webinar in the series titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is a free webinar series with a total of 14 sessions. We meet monthly on the topic of post-qualitative inquiry and the doing of inquiry inspired by a range of post-philosophies. And if you've been joining us on our previous webinars, you'll note that our panelists all engage with a variety of philosophers and theorists and concepts in their work. So it's been really exciting to hear the range of conversations. Each session involves one or two international guests who have experience with inquiry approaches. Some draw on post-humanism, post-structuralism, affect theories, feminist new materialism, and post-colonialism, to name just a few. I am Candace Kuby. I am co-hosting this webinar with Viv Bozalek. The webinar series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. This partnership between our universities started way back in 1986, and we're so glad that it's still going strong today. Funding for the webinar series is provided through the committee that oversees this partnership, and they support academic exchanges between the University of Missouri System and UWC and provide opportunities for teaching and learning, research, and community engagement between the two universities. We are grateful for our university's longtime collaboration and support of this webinar series. These webinars are also available on YouTube. You can go to the website for the webinar series and find a way to access our YouTube channel there. And once you're there, you can select the option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of each webinar. Also, as we've been announcing, we're excited to share that the webinar series is becoming 2 special issues in the Journal of Qualitative Inquiry. So stay tuned, and over time, our panelists will be publishing their webinar in an article format. Also, be sure to check our website for the exact times for the upcoming webinars. We do have some time changes coming up with Sarah Truman's webinar in a few months, as she is in Australia. And so just double check as we have our last couple of webinars that you check the times and the start dates, and maybe use a time zone converter or whatever you need to make sure that you're able to join us for each webinar. So today, our panelists that are joining us today have a long history of collaborating and working together, and we are so excited to have them here together to talk with us collaboratively. So Liz and Natalie, maybe each of you could just unmute, introduce yourself, say hello to folks, and let them know maybe where you're from institutional-wise at the moment in time. So maybe Liz, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I'm Elizabeth the Freitas, and I'm in New York City physically. I'm affiliated with Manchester Met University, but also Adelphi University in New York. And I guess that's all I should say now.
Welcome, Liz. How about you, Natalie?
Hi, I'm Natalie Sinclair, and I'm in Simon Fraser University. I live in Vancouver, and I work on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. And feel fortunate to be sitting here today with you.
Well, welcome to you both. We are excited to engage in dialogue with you today. I also want to introduce Erin Price. Erin Price is a student at the University of Missouri, where she serves as a graduate research assistant with me. Erin is an artist and art educator with experience coordinating preschool through secondary art education in U.S. public schools, as well as community-based art explorations at home and abroad. She's particularly interested in the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters in the becomings of identity and community. I am so grateful that Erin is with us for this webinar series, as Erin is providing a lot of technical support on the webinar platform today, as well as creating the videos that go up on YouTube after each webinar. And in addition, she provided the beautiful artwork for this webinar series that you see on promotional materials. So thanks so much, Erin. Glad that you're with us for this webinar series.
Thank you. And now it's my privilege to introduce our 2 co-hosts. Candace Kuby is an associate professor of learning, teaching, and curriculum at the University of Missouri, where she's also department chair and the director of qualitative inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests are the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She is the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry and Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research. Her scholarship appears in journals including Qualitative Inquiry, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, and the Journal of Literacy Research. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape. She is also an honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, post-humanism and feminist new materialisms, and post-qual and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books include Socially Just Pedagogies, Post-Humanist, Feminist, and Materialist Perspectives in Higher Education, and Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Post-Human and New Materialist Perspectives. So on behalf of myself and all of the participants, YouTube and otherwise, who are able to be a part of these collaborative conversations, I just really thank you both for making this space.
Thanks, Erin. So just a few notes on the Zoom platform and a few overview and instruction about how to engage in our Q&A later, and then we'll jump into conversations with Liz and Natalie. So as you notice, we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of the meeting platform in order to allow a larger number of people to attend. Only host and panelists have the video and audio functions, but we are recording this and we'll post it later on YouTube for viewing. The chat function is open for everyone to connect throughout the webinar, so feel free if you haven't yet and you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat. But we request if you have a question for Liz and Natalie today that you use the Q&A button. So you might locate that at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to populate questions throughout the webinar today. And then when we get to that portion of the webinar toward the end, we'll be sure to check those questions and engage our panelists in them today. The structure of the webinar is as follows. Viv will be our lead interviewer today, and Viv will engage Liz and Natalie in the 4 main questions, which is the common thread for all of these webinars in the series, and you can find them on the webinar webpage. She'll spend about 30 to 40 minutes discussing these 4 questions, and Liz and Natalie might draw some examples from the suggested readings that are also posted on our website. Then Viv will spend a little time talking with Liz and Natalie about how they mentor and teach graduate students while they engage in post-philosophies and the doing of inquiry. And then we'll end today with some time for dialogue and questions from those who are in attendance today. So Viv, I'll turn it over to you if you want to do a little bit more of a fuller introduction of Liz and Natalie, and then jump into some dialogue.
Thanks very much, Candace. So I'm going to first start with Liz. Elizabeth the Freitas, as she said, is professor in the Education and Social Research Institute at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, and also professor of mathematics education at Adelphi University, New York. Her research focuses on philosophical and anthropological investigations of mathematics, science, and technology, pursuing the implications and applications of this work across the social sciences. She's co-editor of What is a Mathematical Concept and the ZDM special issue Body Studies in Mathematics, Different Scales of Mattering, and co-author with Nathalie of Mathematics and the Body, a wonderful book that we've been reading at our university, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Natalie Sinclair is a candidate research chair in tangible mathematics learning at Simon Fraser University and a professor in the Faculty of Education. She's the founding and current editor of Digital Experiences in Mathematics Education and has written several books, including the book that I've just spoken about, Mathematics in the Body, Material Entanglements in the Classroom, as well as over 70 journal articles. Her primary areas of research include the role of digital technologies in mathematics education, the teaching and learning of geometry, and the nature of mathematical embodiment. So we're delighted to have you both with us here today. I think that Liz and Natalie know that we ask these 4 questions of all of our participants, and I'm going to add in a couple of questions if I can, because I was puzzling a lot when reading your papers. So I'd like sort of fuller explanations of some of the things. So just to kick off, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry? Either of you can start.
Oh, okay, I'll start. So philosophical approach, well, certainly I think particular philosophers play an important role in our work. So Gilles Deleuze would figure probably most prominently, most influentially, but we do draw from other people who would be perhaps considered philosophers as well. Karen Barad, Bruno Latour. These are names actually that find themselves located in other disciplines like science and technology studies or anthropology, so, or even sociology. So it's hard to name it as philosophy, but it definitely, I think, we see ourselves as in conversation with a certain philosophical tradition and certain philosophical literature. People like Isabel Stengers and more people from STS, I think, have factored a lot in the book that we wrote together, where we were trying to grapple with the history of philosophical and anthropological engagements with mathematics and science, because that's clearly something that we're collectively invested in. And given the history of STS and the power of a lot of the feminist work that went on in STS, when it was first kind of getting on its feet, let's say in the 70s, 80s, with people like Donna Haraway and Evelyn Fox Keller and so many other wonderful thinkers back then, the lineage, this lineage from STS and this philosophical lineage from that domain, I think is really influential and helps inform and motivate our approach to doing inquiry. And I think also that I would say also that one of the things we do in the later book, the What is a Mathematical Concept, is we also want to make or bring into conversation another philosophical tradition from the philosophy of mathematics, which is a very difficult domain to kind of bring into cultural studies or educational studies, quite often because it comes more from the analytic English, Anglo-American tradition. And what we did in that book was really trying to bring some of those people who work in that field, like David Corfield and others that dabble in analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and to sort of help people working around the cultural studies of mathematics see how there are these really rich philosophical historical traditions that we can turn to when we're starting to think about what does mathematics do in this world, and also, of course, how do we teach it? So maybe that would be my answer, my first answer to that.
Thanks. That's very helpful and sort of broadly sketching, what's influenced you. I just wondered if Natalie had anything to add.
Yeah, I think just to complement that, another source that's been really important for us is related to theories of embodied cognition, that I think have a special importance in the context of mathematics, which is where we've done a lot of work, since mathematics has definitely went in the mind part of the Cartesian mind-body split. So trying to understand what role really the body could play in mathematical thinking, and in both mathematicians, in how concepts come about, but also in mathematics learning and mathematics teaching. So theories of embodiment, like from Merleau-Ponty, but also the metaphor work by Lakoff and Nunez, those were all points in the philosophical sort of landscape that helped us think along with how we wanted to, from a more feminist perspective, bring the body into play in thinking about mathematics. And that led us to Châtelet, who brings together these sort of ideas of embodiment, and Deleuze, and with a new sort of focus around not just the body in general terms, but gestures and diagrams. And that was a rich source of inquiry for us. And has continued to be, and again, relates to our ongoing interests in mathematics itself, and how it gets done and how it evolves historically. And then obviously, how do these practices around gestures and diagramming change in new technology landscapes? So I think maybe just one more thing too, related to the body, that is very close to our thinking about mathematics, but also touches on other interests I think that people have that are here today, is the focus on motion, movement. And again, mathematics is, I mean, if you bring back images of your school mathematics, you probably remember X and maybe some other things that tend to fall into a very sort of static landscape of symbolic thought. And so Liz and I have, been very interested in looking at what is the potential for mobility in mathematical concepts, mathematical thinking. And that again dovetails with Deleuze's work, but is obviously related to gestures as well, because a gesture is a motion, and to our thinking about concepts. So how do these motions of drawing and gesturing relate to mathematical concepts and turn them into more mobile devices? This is laughing.
I know, I'm laughing, sorry. I just wanted to add too, like the Châtelet was so, so catalytic for us, because we read it together via Skype. We've never actually occupied the same city together for any length of time. And it was really helpful for us to think through Châtelet even while we were reading some of the new materialists and theories that have come up in the other webinars that you've hosted. And one of the great things about Deleuze, I think, that brings me back to him all the time, is that he's sort of willing to kind of take on and discuss specific histories of mathematics. And so for Natalie and I, it's really exciting to find philosophers who do that directly and explicitly. And in the case of Deleuze, his philosophy is so significantly tied to his theories of differentiation and other ideas about the mathematical problem, and this kind of direct conversation with mathematics is so rare in cultural studies or in philosophy that we're always looking for people who are willing to do that hard work, I think, of engaging. So the book that we wrote together also draws on Karen Barad, and Barad's again another powerful thinker who takes up physics, right, like quite in quite a lot of detail. And we're always kind of inspired and catalyzed by thinkers who are doing that, because it's quite difficult to do, really. It's quite it's quite hard to kind of engage with the technical side of something, and yet I think the empiricism that we inherit from Deleuze really demands that we do that we really engage with the specificity and the kind of the detail of a practice, right? And so what I hear Natalie talking about, the gesture and the movement, we see that as part of the material practice of mathematics. And it could be the material practice of expert mathematicians, or maverick, or non-human, or what have you. Like, we really try to think of mathematics in broad terms, but looking for the ways in which it's lived as a material practice has been really significant. And so some of these thinkers have been really helpful, I think, to help us get there.
all
I
that
remember, Liz, when we read the Châtelet together, the first time we met in Berlin in 2011 at that little cafe. I haven't thought about that until you said Châtelet being a real catalyst.
Yeah, it really comes across in your book, all these things that you've said. I want to go on to one of your papers that you've more recently written, going to Karen Barad, the one that deals with uncertainty. And I was just sort of puzzled and wanted to ask the two of you how you think this notion of uncertainty affects your methodology, and how it also differs from indeterminacy, because what I understood from her book was that she sort of rejected uncertainty and Heisenberg, and sort of was drawing on Bohr and indeterminacy. So I just wanted from the experts, the mathematical experts, some sort of clarification on that.
Shall I go?
Yeah.
Well, I think uncertainty is sort of the name for the broader mathematical domain of dealing with things that we're not certain of, which is basically most things. But actually, in mathematics, you can build worlds in which you can be certain, like the world in which you know that 50% of the time the dice is going to be heads or tails, because that's your theoretical sort of world that you're working in. But when we're, I think, talking about uncertainty, it was related to decision making. So the ways in which people engage with actions in the world, and the uncertainty involved in that. And that comes out of a long tradition of probability thinking and studying how people respond to questions of do you think it's going to rain tomorrow, which are questions that don't involve certainty.
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question, because we really wanted to talk about this paper today, because it was a incredibly difficult paper to write. We did a lot of work investigating in this whole new area of decision theory, because we were quite intrigued with how they were trying to mobilize ideas of quantum decision theory. And so there's really a fascinating work going on in this field that we knew very little about, very far from our own worlds of education, or even the other social science worlds that we connect with. So we were drawn into that work that's being done. It's very innovative, very bizarre in so many ways, and yet clearly like parallel to what Karen Barad's project is in some ways, in the sense that this is another set of people who are taking up the concept of the quantum and trying to think the social sciences through it. And so we really thought this is important to have this, make sure this kind of conversation was made more visible. We wanted to publish a paper on it. And so we dug into all that literature to find out what kind of notion of the quantum they were working with. And what we found was they were engaging quite concretely with the mathematics of quantum mechanics. And so that, as I said before, was really exciting for us, because we didn't find that in Barad. So we find all the ontology thought and thinking in Barad, but we didn't find her taking up the specific mathematics that was basically becoming the norm for quantum physicists at the time that she's focused on. So we turned to the Alexander Wendt book, which was I think quantum social science or something, and then dug more into the other people who are working in that area. And I think what the paper tries to do is say, is just bring let's look at what's going on there. What do we learn from them that we didn't get from Barad? So I would say the uncertainty piece, like Natalie was saying, is like, I mean, we still live very much with uncertainty. We are epistemic creatures, but what Barad helped bring home is the onto-epistemic, right? Is the kind of the joining and the mixture of that, the ontology and the epistemology. So it's not to, I don't think we move away from Barad in that paper. I think what we just do is try to bring another layer of complexity to how one might think about the quantum in the social sciences or in the humanities. And the tensions between, like when you read the Alexander Wendt book, he is very minor reference to Barad. It's not, so there's these different worlds, right? And it would just be so much better if people could read a little bit more cross-disciplinary. And, we felt that that paper that we wrote began to explore what it might mean to speculate about quantum reasoning and decision theory, which is obviously has not yet been engaged with in the literature that's working with Barad.
And maybe just for people who are listening who haven't read the paper, I think it's interesting to just consider the way in which the idea of quantum reasoning really gives us a different model of reasoning than what we inherited from a sort of Aristotelian logic. And I think for anybody who's interested in what counts as reasoning and what counts as rationality, that it's not just some overarching mathematical rationality that we often name as Eurocentric, but there are different mathematical rationalities, and some of them are, again, they're all models, but some of them are ways of taking into account much more material, social, local kinds of context than the one that we tend to name as the usual or the normative one. So I think there's kind of a meta level interest for Liz and I in using these really powerful tools to explore these basic questions of different forms of rationality and what gets taken as normative and what gets made possible.
Yeah. So one of the things, Natalie, when, what we were thinking as people who work in math education too, we're thinking about how people teach probability or how probability becomes part of the curriculum, or how probability just becomes the norm of the way people conceptualize how we might understand the workings of chance, right? Because probability is just a way of making sense of chance. And so I think it was quite exciting to see, different kinds of probability theory and what it might mean to kind of break the doxa or the canon of the curriculum a little bit by thinking about what does it mean to bring that insight into education then, and begin to realize that the axioms of probability that we take for granted actually could be radically different if we shift to this quantum paradigm. Like things like that. We do a lot of that, I think, in our papers, and in that paper too, we're trying to always bring it back maybe to questions of curriculum or of learning.
Maybe that dovetails into the second question, because I was going to ask you about that, because you applied it to curriculum and pedagogy. But what if you were to apply it to research? What sort of implications would it have? And I want to ask more broadly about your philosophical approach and what it makes thinkable or doable in research.
Okay, well, I can start. So I think, I think that a lot of in terms of making thinkable, so much of our work is about trying to think about the pluralism of the quantitative or the pluralism of mathematics, or to imagine an alien mathematics, to dethrone the idea of a European mathematics that is the ultimate expression of imperialist reason. So I think that we have that kind of objective in our research. So in terms of all the philosophy and the readings that we do, we think of that as a method for pluralizing or thinking pluralistically about mathematics. And I also think, though, that as a making thinkable, what we often find in is that mathematics gets treated as perhaps an inaccurate rendering or representation of the real. And so a critical perspective would be to then critique mathematics curriculum, or to critique mathematics pedagogy, or to do a project that explored the ways in which mathematics was a misrepresentation or a misrecognition of the real. And those are great projects, and I've invested a lot of effort into those kinds of projects, so has Natalie. But I think what we wanted to emphasize was that that mathematics is not just a misrepresentation of the real, that it is in fact part of the aesthetic ontology. And so it has to be seen in all the ways, in all those sort of complicated speculative ways, metaphysical ways that we don't always get to if we're just taking the critical perspective. So there's this, in terms of making thinkable, but also in terms of inquiry, there's this tension where you want to be critical, but you also want to sort of study the creative, generative dimension of this particular material practice as well. I'll just stop now.
Maybe I can add a specific example of that in our work around number, and especially some of the disability research around about dyscalculia. I think our focus on mathematical concepts and on the body allowed us to think about what are the different ways in which thinking about a super simple concept. Well, super simple, it seems simple because we use numbers all the time, but how is your way of thinking about number using different bodily forms of engagement, and how might what the neuroscience scientists are doing, which are who are looking very specifically at images of the brain in action, how is what they're seeing, how can it be relevant to us in understanding the way in which the body functions in thinking about number, and in terms of the pluralism that Liz was talking about, the different possibilities for thinking number that might be more or less available to students. And so in terms of the question about what does it make possible, I think the work or our philosophical approach has really forced us to take that neuroscience research seriously, because it is tempting to brush it away and say it's not really helping us see things, or worse, it's reifying problems and the whole concept of disability, and we want to get as far away from it as possible. But we can also say, yeah, but what can we learn from that can help us understand something as simple as numbers? So I think we really tried to do that, and it brought that our interest in Châtelet and Deleuze and feminist philosophies was what brought us there, what made us attend to the neuroscience literature and to the plurality of mathematics, and think of those two things together.
I think we also, we're just going to kind of go back and forth off each other like we do. That's such a good point, because one of the exciting things about that work was that it, people like Rachel Lambert and people working in the US around special ed, inclusive education, and working very closely with governing bodies around policy, reach out to us. And so we've, been able to develop and communicate and learn, and that work, has allowed us to make that connection. But also we found that the piece that we wrote on number sense and brain research was also taken up by the actual cognitive researchers who were working in the numerical cognition lab in Canada and a few other places. And so what that meant was that, the effort to take up these other territories, let's say, of literature and thinking and of theory, that, quite often you're thinking, oh, I don't really want to invest that time reading all those articles about brain science and number sense. But all that effort that we make, I think, has really been, I found really helpful. I mean, I've been able to connect with, and we've been able to kind of build bridges, let's say, between different perspectives. And I don't know how much, has changed, but certainly the doors of windows of communication were opened, and that's something, right? So I think I also wanted to add to the effort to kind of rethink what the relationship between the physical sciences and the social sciences is or could be. I think that's, that's often the tacit objective behind our work, which is why we kind of move around and take up, we'll have in the same paper have brain scientists and some Marxist theory, and trying to work really hard about how to see where these two things connect. So following Stengers and Haraway and all those other people in STS, trying to kind of rethink what the relationship between the empirical methods of social sciences and the physical sciences might be as we look forward to the Anthropocene.
Yeah. I remember being at an ARA panel on disability and being fascinated at, I think you were talking on, it was about a couple of years ago. But I want to move on to another one of your chapters that you made available. And your chapter on mathematical measurement practices in Ingold's book, and where you indicate the implications of a different way of seeing measurement for pedagogy and curriculum. And again, I was wondering, what are the implications of that also for research or inquiry?
Liz, you can take this one.
Well, just, yeah, well, I think that paper, I think what it's doing is it's just doing the same kind of work that I said that both of us have said we were trying to do, which was displace a unified, orderly image of what constitutes mathematics and help readers grasp and comprehend the diverse material practices that are involved in mathematics. And so that paper does a lot of that work. It goes and talks about, children, experts, accomplished, famous mathematicians, archaeological evidence of diverse nomadic measurement practices, imperialist measurement practices, the emergence of units and the covering of the earth with imperial units in order to encase it in a sphere, to englobe it and to own it. So, what we do in that paper is look at all of these sort of diverse ways in which measurement lives in the world. And I think in terms of, so I think what it does is it hopefully tries to model that practice of as a method of inquiry. But I think also what we wanted to do is measurement is itself such a canonical method in the social sciences and physical sciences. So, engaging directly with measure as a method and beginning to rethink what constitutes the nature of method by that interrogation itself, right? So if measure is usually the baddie that is going to once again misrecognize the real, and indeed, it definitely is going to do that. There's also something else. There's also a kind of secret history of measure that can be exposed. And what we try to do in that chapter for the Tim Ingold book is to look at, use Michel Serres, who does a lot of good work on the history of measure and the history of mathematics, and try to show how method itself is, is that kind of lived, complex, modulating engagement. And what we do with measure then is sort of show how it's relational, show how it's working through analogy, through proportionality rather than portioning. So we try to kind of break down the idea that measure is just this imperial fixing of place, but it also has this generativity. But Natalie will probably do a better job of
No, and just to add that, like, I think our image of measure as we inherit it through quantitative and qualitative methodology is a very, very narrow idea of thinking about measure mathematically, and one that you know, is sort of lodged in the 18th century like the rest of the math curriculum. So it's not just looking at other historical and cultural practices of measure, but also looking at contemporary practices of measure for what they can do to help us offer other modes of measure, because it turns out that it might sound surprising, but mathematicians engaged in a lot of the same concerns that we have, like, you know, the difference between continuous and discrete, the difference between process object, the difference between local global. If you're trying to understand a shape, do you look at just one part of it, or do you try to sort of characterize the whole thing? And in mathematics, you can take those on simultaneously, but there's also some tensions in doing that. So in mathematics itself, there's a recognition of the tension and also attempts to sort of figure out how to go back and forth between them, depending on what you're trying to solve as a problem, let's say. So those, we in the Tim Ingold paper, we didn't get a chance to talk a lot about some of those more contemporary practices. But that is certainly something that interests us, and that interests us not just for research, but also for curriculum. You know, why is it that we're so stuck in this very narrow idea of measurement, given all of the critiques that we have of it?
Yeah.
Can I just add something too, because Natalie's helped me think about how that triggers some of the work that you know, we've been doing at MMU and in our Manifold lab, which has been to kind of think, and some of the work that I've done, you know, around rethinking the quantitative method. So at MMU, in the lab, we do a lot of experimenting with digital methods, and you know, we do experiments with methods that might have been conceptualized as measure methods and devices that measure something. And, you know, what we've tried to do is show that that idea of measuring is so complex and so complicated in terms of what's actually going on, that it's not just by any means an accurate accounting of something, but it's actually engaged in a process as soon as it begins to measure. So this is kind of a classic understanding of how measure and measurement devices are implicated in what it is that you're doing. And, you know, I guess it's just, when Natalie was speaking, I suddenly thought, oh, that might be a worthwhile connection for the webinar theme.
Yeah, I think Berard also sort of brings that into her work, doesn't she?
Yeah, oh, yeah. Can I just say one
yeah.
quick thing, because I think that's also how in other work around technology, in terms of method, that we've really been thinking is how is that technology in its Baradian measurement sense allowing us to create new mathematical concepts. So it's you know, not really it's an ontological thing. You know, kids are working with apps that involve number, and you can think to yourself, don't we know everything there is to know about number already? It's all in the curriculum. But instead, if we think of these new technologies as disclosing new, you know, relations involving number, then that allows us to study them as new, you know, cuts, new measurements that then become very well, exciting, because they're happening right there in front of you, and productive too.
Before we get on to the third question, I wanted to ask you also about causality and agency, because you did write about it. I can't remember all of these papers and where these things are, and about queering time and the importance of queering time in terms of causality and agency. So can you say a little about that? And I know she's also, written quite a lot about that, Barad.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, you have to talk about causality. I think in the Mathematics in the Body book, we talk about agency, and we try to sort of theorize the nature of agency. And we drew quite extensively from Latour's notion of the actant to help us do that, feeding into the work that Natalie was speaking about around technology, especially, and its role in learning. But I'm going to let Natalie answer that one more carefully, because it's a harder question. I just wanted to speak about the queering time, just because I've been very much immersed that's my little puppy, sorry. Immersed in Kara Keeling's incredible book, Queer Time, Black Futures. We've been reading it in an intensive reading seminar at MMU this week, and I've been reading it for a couple of years, and so I'm just reminded most immediately of the way she talks about queering time. And I think what we were trying to do in terms of using queerness and temporality together in the writing is done so much better in the Kara Keeling book, where she talks about how there's a kind of queerness inherent to time and temporality, and that what you need to do is sort of break that open. And she talks about poetry and the arts and the creative ways in which temporality can be queered, and the ways in which that leaves space for all sorts of freedom projects and notions of radical Black imagination and kind of rethinking the role of the imagination. And so I think queerness and temporality are really, coupled in that very effective way, like in terms of effectuating something. I think it's really powerful the way Keeling talks about it. And I think it connects with the question of causality and agency, and Karen Barad's attempts to kind of just sort of spread causality, Latour's attempt to sort of rethink causality. So many of the people that we're drawing from are trying to sort of rethink what the quasi-cause could be. It's a complicated question, because there's a definitive pragmatic nature to our embodiment, and it would seem rather foolish to cast out the concept of causality. So I think the work that has to be done is actually a rethinking, a revisioning of, what causality could be that would be more suitable in terms of our understanding of a quantum form of existence, or technical modes of being, or alien mathematics, or what have you. So that would be as far as I could go into the causality question.
Thanks.
Maybe just to add a little around agency, Liz mentioned Latour. Another person who was important at the beginning for us was Andrew Pickering, also from STS, who was looking at what he calls the mangle of practice in science, which is the individual, the discipline, and the material, and how they are involved in some kind of dance of agency. And in his book, he has one chapter on mathematics, and there's no material. It's just the agent, it's just the individual and the disciplinary. And that was great, because it forced us to insert the material there and think about how that would look like in mathematics, and which is why we focus so much eventually on gestures and diagrams. But just to bring it back to how we think about this dance or whatever in terms of agency at a very basic level. It's very common in our field of mathematics education, the didactic triangle. So you either have the student, the tool, and the mathematics, or the student teacher mathematics. So these three sort of nodes. And one thing I think that we've been pushing on a lot is to turn the nodes into lines. So what if we think the student tool as one thing? How does that change our theories about mediation, about interiorization, about representation? They all go away. You don't need them anymore. So sort of exploring the consequences of that, using this very, I think, powerful spatial imaginary that people have around how learning happens. So it's kind of very practical, but because it is such a powerful image, that triangle, I think it's been a place where we've been able to really sort of push on where is the agency in that triangle, and how might we rethink it?
I thought that was really good in your book when you were talking about activity theory and Vygotsky. I found that very helpful. I'm going to move on to the third question because I see that time is sort of moving on, about methodologies and methods, and how you envisage that in your approaches to inquiry.
Do you want to start, Natalie?
Okay, so well, in the book, I think we definitely use a lot of video ethnography kinds of methods. We were focused a lot on what was happening with technology, with the hand, with the moving mathematical objects. So it was really useful for us to be able to use the videos as places to not only sort of see what happened, but also to think what happened. Like, for example, in the chapter where we talk about the girl who is putting numbers on the screen, and we use Deleuze's idea of the sort of going back and forth of whether it's the eye or the hand that's sort of in charge. I think having that video and not looking at it as a intact whole, but instead looking at the eye and looking at the hand as two different bodies in a way, was really helpful, because it did make apparent relations and changes and evolutions that we wouldn't have been able to see if we didn't have those videos. So that has definitely been a source of insight, I think, for us. And then I'll let Liz talk about some of the other methods that we've been exploring, but she's already, I think, alluded to the way in which both history and philosophy as method have been central to us. And Liz, maybe you want to say a little bit more, especially about philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've advocated for, in our own field, more the use of historical methods, you know, and history as a method, which is just not as well relied on in education research, but also philosophical investigations are methods. So I'm sort of on the side of, like, methods are not necessarily bad things, you know, and I know that the last few years I've seen many discussions around the method as an apparatus of capture, but I tend to think that that methods are like entrenched habits, and they can definitely be you know, completely controlling and inhibiting of emergent new practices, and they can definitely be procedural and empty-headed. But they are also, I think, probably the way we get out of things. That I think, you know, you have to sort of try to invent new methods, but also, you know, and also, again, historically always know how those are thread into the old ones. And I think philosophically, I mean, the method is, you know, Descartes had a method, right? Like his method of doubt was his method, and the extent to which, you know, we think he got led astray by that method is really important to reflect on. And one of the philosophers that I've written quite a lot on is Henri Bergson and his way in which we can think about learning through Bergson. And you know, he described his approach as an intuitive method. And one of the things that characterized that method was that the first thing you should do is always sort of expose the poorly formed problem, like expose how the problem that's as it's been posed is not well posed. And I think that's, let's name it a method. I mean, sometimes it's really helpful when you're working with students, you know, if you see this as a method and you try something on and see where it can go. So, you know, just to say that, I think even in the history of philosophy, we see pretty powerful methods that we can learn from, and perhaps, you know, maybe there are, as they are, you know, with the work of people who've already spoken on this webinar, really interesting diffractive methods. Though I know we're often hesitant to name them as methods because within the social sciences, that often means a kind of routine blanketing, thoughtless blanketing. I don't think Natalie and I come from that world. Like neither she nor I really were raised in the social sciences. We both have backgrounds in mathematics, but then we both have degrees in the humanities, in history of mathematics and history of science. So, you know, we don't have the same reaction maybe to that concept of method.
Well, in reading your papers, I had a few questions about methods, which sort of came up. One was about composting as method for what you call current concrete empirical practice. That was what you wrote with Trumi. And you also wrote about apparatus and the role that apparatus plays in research methods. So either of you can answer any of these. And then you spoke about unreliable narrators in science fiction. And I said, do you think they exist also in post-philosophies as forms of partial, situated, and contested knowledges? And if so, how does this work? And how would that relate to trustworthiness in research? And then the thing I really liked was this idea of undergoing inquiry by being played by the environment or merging with the environment. I think that was the Fundelier, or surrendering to the environmental force as you perform. And it seems sort of reminiscent with Erin Manning's discussion of research creation. So those are just sort of some ideas that came from reading your works.
Wow, those are a lot of really hard questions. I'm gonna, the composting, yeah, so some of those come out of, so I'll just speak first, Natalie, but I think we both have lots to say about apparatus and method. And but the first question about composting and unreliable narrators comes from the paper, or two papers actually, that Sarah Truman and I wrote together about working with some speculative fiction and thinking about the epistemic status of scientific truth claims in today's environment in different locales. But we stayed close to the fiction and the power of fiction, really, to help us think with and about those questions that you're raising. So the unreliable narrator was used in the work of fiction that we were examining, and it's an interesting device, right? It's a device of creative craft writing, fiction writing, to help a reader become more engaged with the text and to take on some responsibility even for the text, but also to query and to wonder and to feel the uncertainty of their location and their understanding of both the narrative and that which it refers to. So you're asking, do we find these unreliable narratives in post-philosophy? I think, I think one of the things Sarah and I did was point to a couple of examples that we thought were inspiring recent work in STS. I don't know if it, if it falls under the umbrella of post-philosophy, but what we were trying to do was look at post-human ethnographies, ethnographic practices that again were associated with STS, and looking at a kind of an attempt to sort of think with an annihilation and a bit of a, like annihilation is the name of the book that we were discussing. So it played the concept of annihilation and the end times factors really importantly in the story and in our attempt to kind of think what it means to try and do inquiry today. So I think there are little examples. In the article, we mentioned a few, but the unreliable narrator is complicated, but perhaps all we really can move towards in a kind of post, especially in this very complex post-truth or place where we do see a complex shifting of hierarchies of trust, and sometimes in good ways and sometimes not in good ways. The composting is linked directly to that question that you've asked. So almost as a kind of way of being, it's something that Haraway talks about as
well. Nathalie?
Maybe I'll just jump off a little bit and go in a slightly different direction off of the idea of apparatus and kind of come around back to the diagram, which recently we've been using as an apparatus in a way of thinking method. So, the Châtelet book was really showing how diagramming had been a source of new development in mathematics. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari talk about diagrammatic thinking and the diagram in a similar way. Very recently, Denise Ferreira da Silva has talked about the critical and then the speculative, and how important the speculative is in terms of providing new ways of thinking that are not rooted in experience, and so that have a chance of sort of kind of escaping, if you want, the social constructed nature. She's talking about race, of course, but we could think about it. So we've been thinking about that in other ways. How can we use diagrams as apparati to try to create new relations? And we've been doing that in the context of a project that we're working on. I'm sure everybody has been a part of one of these international projects where you're all like, it's a big complicated grant to get and you're all supposed to do a part of it and then compare and contrast or whatever. So there's a kind of local global push and pull going around that often in the search for comparing and contrasting ends up staying at the global level and forgetting some of the local stuff, or getting sort of taken over by one local reality. And so we've been trying to use diagramming techniques to think about what are other ways for us to imagine this partnership and what's coming out of it, that don't fall back either into a local or a global sort of framing. And the diagramming techniques have been motivated again by mathematical ideas. So taking a mathematical transformation that has nothing to do with real life and seeing what happens, like an experiment, and then seeing, okay, wow, I never thought of these two things as being able to form a space or a relation, and how does this help us understand the new dynamics that we hadn't noticed before. So so that's been really interesting and difficult, because it's again, I think one of these, Liz and I often have a challenge figuring out where to put our papers, because the math part often turns off a lot of people. And but we don't always want it in math places. So the quantum paper that we discussed early on is sort of buried in a very small niche math place where nobody's going to read it. Yeah, I'm sure we're not the only ones who have this challenge.
I'm sure not. We're at 17:35 here, so we've got about 25 minutes. I want to go to the last question just before we open it up more generally for questions. And it's about you and your students. And I mean, talking about sort of traversing fields as you are now. And I mean, if you're having difficulty sort of putting your work out there in journals that you want people to read about it, you know, is it easy or difficult for your students? And, you know, where are you, because you're so placed in many different fields, both in education and mathematics and philosophy. So how does that work with your students? And do you have any difficulty in this regard? And also in your institutional context?
Maybe I'll just speak a little briefly about SFU. So there isn't really, I know Betty talked about some of the challenges in her institution in terms of what kinds of research is allowed. And I have to say that at SFU, we are very open to very broad ways of thinking research. I think maybe we were the first PhD that was a dance. But you know, that doesn't happen. That didn't happen in the Faculty of Education. But anyway,
people could just dance their PhDs.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word just, but anyway, they.
Oh, we were just talking about this because somebody who's here who's a PhD student said, that's what I want to do is dance my PhD. So maybe she must re-register elsewhere.
So nobody's tried to do that in math education, but just to give a context of the university as a whole. But that doesn't make it easier necessarily to figure out, you know, engaging in Barad and the scholars that we've been talking about takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of not everybody wants to do it. I can't ask all of my students in math education in our first semester together, okay, let's read Deleuze, you know, that I haven't been able to allow myself to do that yet. So, but one thing that I just wanted to bring up that I think has worked relatively well, though it just happened once, it's still having ripple effects. And I know Jackie is here today, so she is that we, a group of us at SFU in the Faculty of Education, got together, and we were from different areas of education, and we put on a seminar series that was focused on new materialism, and invited people like Lisa, Mazai, and Liz, and Iris to give talks, and so the students were there, and that was incredibly sort of fruitful in terms of bringing students together and giving them a community that they could continue sort of at least talking to each other, if not to their supervisors, around some of these ideas. And they continued this sort of work by starting a club in which they meet once a month and read a book, and have really, like, in the end, brought the faculty together around them, because what they're doing is more interesting than what we're doing. So it sometimes just, you know, takes like a bringing together of people, an initial event, to sort of provide that community, which is very, very important. And I don't think you can do alone in the context of a class or something.
Yeah, wonderful. Liz?
Well, I mean, I could say that we at MMU have a really strong theory and methodology group, and have been, you know, heroically led, I'd say, by Maggie McClure for many years now, in terms of cultivating doctorate risk-taking and important experimental work. Specifically, I think that the many reading seminars and events that we host there are really helpful. I did want to plug the new Matter journal that I'm sure Viv could put the link to, which was also spearheaded by new doc students coming into the field who are really interested in the kind of work that you guys are sharing through this webinar. That's all.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we've got about 20 minutes left for questions. I'm going to hand over to Candace and Erin, and thank you both very much for engaging. It was very interesting, I must say.
Yeah, so we do have a bit of time. I know we have one question that's come into the Q&A box, but just as a reminder for all of those that are with us today, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. So if you have questions for Liz and or Natalie, if you'll go ahead and type them there, myself and Erin are happy to read through them and pose the questions to hear what their responses might be. There's also comments in our chat box as well as people have reacted to some of the things that you've been talking about today. So I'll start with the first question. The question is, how would you put your work, perhaps considering the chapter in Knowing from the Inside, in conversation with ethnomathematics?
Well, very, very close. I mean, I think both Liz and I maybe this is a nice moment to recognize the work of an absolutely incredible math educator whose name was Uribitan D'Ambrosio, who recently passed away, and who was really one of the founding sort of thinkers around ethnomathematics in Brazil, and had a huge influence on mathematics education research. And on both Liz and I think I can say Liz. So that work around sort of looking at different mathematical practices in different cultures, I think is definitely one that aligns with our interest in the chapter in the Ingold book. One thing that happened two things I think that happened in that ethnomathematics literature. One is that a lot of the work was around mathematizing the cultural practice, and that mathematizing was always done within a sort of more European mathematical tradition, which doesn't mean it was not interesting. There was some like beautiful mathematical ideas that were brought out and sort of expressed in ways that were very different from where they were located within their cultural practices. But the effect of that was that the point of doing ethnomathematics was to turn it into Western mathematics, and that became problematic. And then the other issue that came out, I think, is that the way in which ethnomathematics was framed early on or understood early on was still within this binary of either your ethno or your real or something, or right or correct. And obviously within that binary, ethnomathematics always ends up being sort of read in terms of the real or the correct or the Western mathematics. So in the work that Liz and I are doing, I think we're really trying to build the argument that refuses to subscribe to that binary. Because if we do that, then everything that we talk about in terms of the historical practices will just be seen as, well, that's not the correct Western mathematics. So we are thinking about that work around ethnomathematics and thinking about and especially attentive to what happened to that work.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think I totally agree with her kind of recounting of what the issues were, let's say, within ethnomathematics, but also the incredible insights from that field and the ways in which we're in conversation with it, which come to light, I think, a little bit in the Ingold chapter. Yeah, I mean, it's, and it'll be interesting. And I think also that I guess I see right now the importance of, specifically now, the importance of taking on that question that you've raised about the role of ethnomathematics today, and the ways in which it's inflecting through new theoretical insights and new ideas about that come from all over. So I think that's all I would add. I thought that was a really nice answer.
Well, maybe I'll, just to be specific, Liz, I don't know if this was what you were talking about, but for example, in where I live in British Columbia, we've been asked to indigenize our curriculum, including our math curriculum. So that means we're supposed to be thinking about what is an indigenous mathematics, or rather what is an indigenous mathematics of British Columbia. That has ties to ethnomathematics, because it is about looking at the cultural practices of people who lived here and continue to live here, and trying to understand in their terms and within their practices what mathematical ideas or ways of thinking we could be including in the math curriculum, and how to make sure that when we do that, it doesn't become one of the things that one of the ways in which the indigenous thinking has been characterized is about that it's important to take time to learn. So now in the curriculum, if they say, okay, take your time to learn. Okay, now we're being in, we're following the invitation to indigenize the curriculum. So that obviously is not a good way of doing it. Nobody's happy with that. But it is engaging with these very similar issues. And I think in the US, a recent book that Liz sent me that has come up, and maybe inspired by some of the work of Rochelle Gutierrez, but also in thinking about culturally responsive mathematics. I think that there's some ties to that literature too.
Well, our next question is a bit of a change of pace. There was a request that you elaborate on how you mentor and advise students who take risks in their doctoral explorations.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, I mean, the doc students that I've worked with thus far come to me with really exciting, risky questions, I think. And so, first off, the first act is to say yes, to affirm yes, follow that question. Definitely just invest your effort, your time, your passion, and kind of keep it risky, I guess, is then the sort of next sustained engagement. But also I'd say that I am someone who, I think as a supervisor, I'm conscious of the fact though that I want to sustain that riskiness and also kind of ensure that you're still in sustained conversation with fields that are moving more slowly than you. And PhD students are always at the forefront, the frontier. That's their job, is to be doing the risky, fun, interrogating stuff. And part of my job as a supervisor is to definitely encourage that and cultivate it, but also to help them stay in conversation so that they know, exactly how this situates in relation to what happened in ethnomathematics, 20 years ago, let's say, or what happened in STS and feminist critiques of science and technology in the 80s. So I think that there's a sense in which often the riskiness needs to be sustained in conversation with a lot of reading that keeps you tied and grounded. And I think what that does is it empowers people to be able to speak back when someone says, you know, you've shown some creative dancing here, you know, how exactly does this matter? You know, what is this, what's the value of this? And that's, of course, the hardest question that we all get. And often a good answer to that, perhaps semi-adequate answer to that, is to explain how its value is in relation to that which has come before. So it's not simply that it's innovative for the sake of innovation, but that it speaks to historical trajectories, the afterlives of many consequential historical events. You know, always sort of thinking historically, I think, helps sustain the power of the risk-taking for new scholars.
I guess I would just add, I think maybe I mean, I couldn't agree with Liz more in terms of the reading, but I think it depends on what kind of risk also that people are talking about. So I think in addition to reading, sort of having conversations with people, you know, other faculty members, community members, to try to understand how the question or the interest might matter to other people and might be uncomfortable for other people. I think sometimes we get caught up either from personal experience or some reading, I want to do this, without sort of thinking about how that might resonate with or have repercussions on particular communities or people. So I mean, it's not really like the elevator pitch thing, but it is sort of, you know, go out into the world and send these ideas out and hear what comes back to you, listen carefully to what comes back to you.
Thanks. So another question that's come up is if you could give recommendations of Black, Brown, queer scholars that you engage with in your work. So I know Kara Keeling is a name that came up. I remember reading it in the piece that you suggested for today. But do you have others that are really sparking your thought or you're putting into conversation with some of the concepts and the inquiries and the topics that you've been talking about today?
Yeah, I could start with that. Well, so we've been thinking with and reading Edouard Glissant and his amazing book called Poetics of Relation. And that's something that started for me anyway in a reading group about 2 years ago with Laura Traffy-Pratts and some other people, a reading group that we've sustained and in fact we're carrying on this week with. So Glissant's book is this amazing, beautiful, beautiful book. He was a poet, a Caribbean poet from the island of Martinique, writing originally in French, but very determined to examine the role of language, so and of creolizations of language and of being. He's a fascinating thinker that Natalie and I have tried to think with him about the project she was mentioning around mapping and graphing and international relationships, because Glissant is someone who advocates for what he calls the two mondes, or some way of thinking totality, which is not totalitarianism, some way of thinking the archipelagic and the multiplicity diffractive Caribbean sea of islands, rather than the continent, you know, the metropolis and the periphery, or the empire and the colony. So Glissant is really someone who I've been thinking with for not that long, just a few years, as I said, but we have been, you know, moving with him, I think, recently. And then I'll just plug some of the books that are part of this intensive reading seminar that Laura Traffy-Pratts and I have organized, that's going on at MMU this week. So I'll just mention a few other ones. One of them is the Kara Keeling, Queer Times, Black Futures. And Natalie's in the intensive reading seminar this week as well. So Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics. I think I meant, oh no, maybe I didn't mention that. That was somewhere else today. The Sound of Culture, Diaspora and Black Technopolitics is one of the 6 books that we're looking at by Louis Chude Soke. So I'm trying to read my screen without my glasses. The Zakiya Iman Jackson book called Becoming Human, and Kevin Quashie, so that's Quashie, Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being. These are 6 really brilliant, beautiful books. And we've obviously been preparing and reading them for months now. And this week we're discussing these. So the glissant is something, as I said, we've been traveling with for a while. And same with the Karakiling. The other books are new to me, but I have a feeling that they are imprinting in a major way. So those would be the ones that I would suggest or mention.
So I want to say thanks to Natalie, who's typing those as you shared them, Liz. So thank you, because I know lots of people were asking, can you spell the name? But do you have others, Natalie, that you want to chime in on as well?
Oh, I just wanted to add this one, just because it's relevant to some of the things that Liz and I have been talking about today around math and science, which is called Dear Science by Catherine McKittrick. She has other books too, but this is just her newest one. And I think it's also very interesting to us. She's got a whole chapter on footnotes and a whole chapter on citation practices. And that's, I think, very interesting to us to think about as academics and how we work through some of those challenges. And she's got really some, I think, some very interesting things, provocative things to say about that.
Do you mind putting that in the chat as well for
people,
Natalie? That'd be great. And then also I want to mention that Viv did post in the chat the Matter, the journal that was talked about earlier. Viv posted the link there in the chat if others want to be able to check that out. We have a question that came through in a roundabout way from Viv. There's lots of students at Viv's house right now. And so there is a question that they would like to hear perhaps Natalie talk a little bit more about. So the students want to know why a line is better than a node, and also what is a beautiful mathematical concept.
Okay. I don't want to forget to put in this last person's name in here, but I won't do it now. So why is a line better than a node? Well, I guess I wouldn't say that like categorically lines are better than nodes. Nodes are important too, but in the context of what the work that Liz and I were doing around agency, it's about whether you begin by separating, for example, the subject and object as 2 different things, and then start looking at how they're related, or whether you start thinking of them as one thing, and then maybe think about how they individuate, let's say. So, I mean, this is a Karen Barad idea too around entanglement, and Whitehead idea. So lots of people try to work with this idea, and what the line does is focus your attention on the relation rather than on the objects. And what the line also does is very easy because it connects the things. But the line also has its own problems. Tim Ingold has a beautiful book on lines, looking at how the very concept of line has again structured our ways of understanding the world and relationships with it. So I'm giving a talk tomorrow that's all about the problem of the line and thinking of it, because it inherits sort of linearity, ideas of progress, ideas of shortest distance, which are connected to efficiency and speed, and one dimensionality. The line it lives just in one dimension. So there's a lot of things you can say about the line too. So it's not necessarily better, but it's about just sort of thinking about how those images shift our attention from one way of thinking about things to another. So I'm kind of all about the squiggle now. So instead of having a line between the 2 nodes, you just imagine a squiggle. And I'm prepared to say the squiggle is best now. And then I forgot what the other question was, because that was a fun question to answer.
What makes a beautiful mathematical concept?
Oh, yeah, I really did say squiggle. Well, to me, I think what makes a very beautiful mathematical concept? I mean, there's a whole literature on this. There's a whole literature on aesthetics of mathematics, and on sort of cultural norms around what gets considered beautiful. So things that are elegant, surprising, insightful, that surprisingly sort of bring two very different ideas together. It's not so different sometimes than in art. There are also those mathematicians who love like the things that are crazy, like singularities or 17 dimensions, or you can sort of think more of postmodern art. There's also postmodern mathematics, and it can depend in kind of what mood you're in. So everybody's seen fractals, and they're often described as being very beautiful. But if you've seen too many of them, you're kind of like, oh, that's a bit boring. So I don't really find fractals very exciting anymore. I find very, personally, I find very beautiful ways of understanding mathematical concepts that focus on visualizing and moving things. So especially things that we've thought of in more analytic or algebraic terms before. So everybody studied the parabola in school, and you probably remember like y equals x squared plus 3 or whatever, and you did all of that manipulation, and that equation sort of doesn't bring very much imagery to mind. But if you think of the parabola as the points that are equidistant from a given point and a line, you don't have to think of x's anymore. You can just think of your line and your point and look at, well, where are all the places that are going to be the same distance away from the line as they are from the point? And if you plot them all out, you get this parabola, and then you can think of, well, what happens if my line and my point are further apart? So I find those kinds of ideas beautiful, because they give me a very generative way of thinking that I mean, maybe connects more to other ideas.
I was just going to add, Natalie, that Natalie and I have also written about the aesthetics of mathematics and thinking of, and Natalie has a great book on that topic. And we've also tried to work with that question of what is the beautiful in mathematics, using kind of more political theory of the aesthetic, and about the distribution of the sensible, and questions of access. And so the kind of brilliant investigations of ideas that Natalie's talking about are ways of materially and sensually really engaging with the idea of the parabola, and to what extent are people given that kind of access or not is one of the political questions in education. So this idea of the beautiful is something that has to be kind of situated within a theory of the sensible, the intelligible, and the distribution of that access in different environments, different schools, different locations. And the body, of course, the specificity of the human body, and the symmetry and the particular sensory capacities that the human body is, best at. Those things obviously feed into a particular kind of sense of the beautiful in mathematics. And we all know other kinds of creatures and would have very different sensitive, sensible engagements with an aesthetic associated with number or the quantitative or mathematics.
We're actually over our time today, and I have a feeling that we could continue this for a while. Probably lots of questions that we would love to engage you with, but we'll honor the time today and wrap it up here. Viv or Erin, any last words that you'd like to share before we close?
I was just thinking, I'm thinking about making t-shirts that say keep it risky and the squiggle is best. Just some taglines for the day. Thank you.
No, just thanks very much for coming and engaging. It was great.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Well, thanks to you both, Liz and Natalie, for just taking time to have conversation with us today, for being candid and honest about your experience as scholars and kind of, different fields and disciplines that you engage in, and sometimes the tensions of doing work across those different areas. I think especially our students who are with us today are probably really enjoying hearing some of your tips and suggestions and ways that you navigate. So thank you for engaging us in that conversation. And thanks to all who are attending today. As we stated before, we have recorded the webinar and we will post it on our YouTube channel, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So just stay tuned for that. If you subscribe to the channel, you should get some updates when that new one is released. As a reminder, our next webinar is on June the 17th. We will be in conversation with Eve Tuck and Fikile Numalo. Please check the webinar website to confirm the times and to access the Zoom link. Also, there are suggested readings for the website on our website for the next webinar, or you can contact Erin Price if you need access to them and have trouble getting them yourself. I think that's all for today. Anything else, Viv, before we sign off?
No, nothing.
No. Well, thanks both to you, Natalie and Liz. If you want to say anything final, feel free to, and then we'll end for the day.